This video is going to be part of the Players series, and again this one will apply to both the UP Norfolk Southern merger as well as overall to the Rail Families United YouTube channel and website. So the player that we'll be looking at today is Union Pacific CEO. He's been there since August 2023. He was also the former CN-Rail Chief Operations Officer from 2013 to 2016, and he is the current chairman of the Association of American Railroads as of today when I'm doing this video. And that man is Jim Vena. Before I keep going in this video, I want to mention Jim Vena, when he was Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail. That period of time was when my own child was a conductor trainee and became a qualified conductor, fake qualified conductor at CN Rail. And it's also the time when a conductor trainee who was conductor trainee at the same time as my child was killed in a rail accident, and that was conductor trainee Jason Cluney, who would be the subject of what I call a dissection of a rail worker death investigation, which would take me literally 4 years to complete. And I'm really not even all done because some of the materials the government of Canada still refuses to release. I'm sure because they're very nasty, like the last 5 pages of the supervising conductor's witness statement. But anyway, let me explain for those who have not heard this yet what I mean by fake qualified. My child was a conductor trainee, again, right around the same time as conductor trainee Jason Cluney. And my child ended up moving from a rail yard of 2 or 3 switches a day, 2 or 3 trains a day, to a rail yard with 40 to 60 trains a day on the main line, with hundreds of employees in that terminal, and potentially hundreds of switches in that yard. Now, after about a year of being there, my child was mainly doing line trips, but they were then, involved in yard tours or yard trips too, where they were working in the yard, supposedly as a qualified conductor. And about a year or so after moving, my child was involved in a minor derailment because there was ice on a track in the yard and one of the wheels popped. And my child was hanging on to a grain car. Now, had the load shifted enough, that rail car could have just flipped over and immediately killed my child. But because a wheel had popped, considered a derailment, you get a notice to appear or a statement where you have to go with your union rep in front of management and give your side of the story. And so because my child was new to this terminal and had not been involved in any incidents there previously, the union rep, who had, I believe, over 20 years of experience at CN Rail, had to look up my child's records to see if they'd been involved in a previous incident at another work location, and they had not. But in looking at my child's record, something stood out for that new union rep. And he came up to my child and basically said, "How many yard shifts do you need to be a qualified conductor?" And my child told them, I think it's 15. And so this guy goes, "How many do you have?" To which my child responded, "Well, at least that many. I worked in this location, this other location, for months." And to that, this very experienced union rep and rail worker responded, "That's considered a switcher location. You have 0. And so CN allowed my child to go from this little teeny terminal to a massive terminal with 0 yard training. potentially putting my child's life at risk as well as that of all other coworkers in that terminal. And, potentially also for customer locations where my child would be working if they didn't have the proper training for working in a yard. Now, here's the issue. If my child was fake qualified, and I suspect conductor trainee Jason Cluney was fake qualified because the word in the field was, even though he had 0 yard training, which I would find out when I obtained information via Freedom of Information, and all the documentation that came to me as a result of that. But the word in the field among the conductor trainees and the newly qualified conductors, and these guys had gone to class together as conductor trainees, they had worked pretty well together in the field, whatever. So they knew of or knew each other. And the word in the field, according to people that would have known of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, and one specifically that I knew personally, and this was not my child, it was another one, was that conductor trainee Jason Cluney was being qualified the day he was killed. And the person who told that to my child, when my child got the call that this conductor trainee had been killed in the field, the person who told that to my child worked in, northern Saskatchewan, the same area potentially where conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. It was either the same subdivision or one right next to it where this one worked. And so the point being here, folks, is if we're training all these conductor trainees in these little remote locations all over Canada, potentially all over the US too, since CN Rail has massive lines there. And I would say the same would apply to CP, because there's CP executives that used to be at CN Rail as chief operations officers, like Keith Creel, who is now the chief executive officer at CP, and he was certainly at CN when there were clearly serious issues with what was going on in operations at CN Rail. But the death specifically of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, that one was under Jim Vena. And so there's no way that he was not part of that cover-up, in my humble opinion, as Chief Operations Officer. And the same would be true for then CN Rail CEO Claude Mongeau, who would become chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern. And Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern are now looking to merge in what would be one of the biggest rail mergers ever, an $85 billion deal. And so frontline rail workers in the U.S., you need to be on board. You need to understand the issues as they existed and they exist in the U.S., the players, and also where they came from and what they did at CN Rail. But anyways, if you're training all of these rail workers in these little rinky-dink terminals and you make them think they're qualified, and then those people move on, like my child, to a much larger terminal, and they haven't had the proper training. Is that not criminal negligence on the part of CN Rail? I would argue that it is. And I think the case could be made by lawyers that it is. So the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney and my total dissection of the reports tied to that death, the Transportation Safety Board report, which is about 22 pages, I believe, the Transport Canada Health and Safety Officer report, which is about 80 pages long, the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada hearing pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, that one's also 20-some pages, I believe. Folks, these are nothing but rags of lies, in my humble opinion, and I would encourage you to look at all the videos that I have done ripping apart this rail worker death investigation, paid for by taxpayers, and, misappropriation of public funds to death cover-ups and to garbage investigations, garbage reports, garbage tribunal hearings. That's breach of public trust. And both misappropriation of public funds and breach of public trust are criminal offenses. And so, as is financial fraud. And I would argue, folks, the CEO of CN Rail at the time, Claude Mongeau, as well as the Chief Operations Officer, there's no way these men did not know that CN was violating many laws when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And given I suspect both were absolutely part of the cover-up in that death, and would that not also be financial fraud? That you're letting investors think that your company is properly training its workforce, that you're not engaged in criminal negligence or the violation of so many laws, including the Railway Safety Act, specifically Section 20, when numerous changes, and I would say deadly changes, are done to frontline rail worker training programs, as was done in the case of conductor trainee Jason Cluney and many others. And we're talking dating back to 2007. So those are definitely the Keith Creel days as far as violations of laws. And, there's other things that were going on. The violation of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulations, specifically Section 5, pertaining to the fact that if you're not a qualified conductor, you're not supposed to be working alone. That one's pretty cut and dried. Conductor trainee Jason Cluney was in unfamiliar territory, about 2/3 of a mile from the supposed supervising conductor who had never been trained, even though he had years at CN Rail, he had never been trained in how to properly supervise a conductor trainee. And so there's other issues, but you will see all of those in the materials provided in the Brainwashing series and in the series called, the Brainwashing series has to do with, that first one looks at the Transportation Safety Board and the death cover-up pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney by the Transportation Safety Board, with Claude Mongeau, who became chairman of the board at Norfolk Southern, having signed off on the draft report pertaining to its accuracy and completeness in the interest of promoting rail worker safety in Canada. When you look at that report, I think you're going to find in my analysis of it that if you had assumed it was nothing but a rag of lies, you would have been closer to the truth than what was actually provided in that report. And again, that report was also written under Jim Vena, who was Chief Operations Officer at the time. And so all the issues that are raised in that report, and which I address in my series on brainwashing and also on the deadly training materials and deadly field practices at CN Rail, all of that happened under Jim Vena and Claude Mongeau, players at both Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, even though Claude Mongeau stepped down, even though, if you got rid of these men tomorrow, they were there. Claude Mongeau was for a very long time at Norfolk Southern, and Jim Vena had 2 stints at Union Pacific. He acted as Chief Operations Officer, and after the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, he went there as a Chief Operations Officer in like 2019 timeframe, and also now as Union Pacific CEO. And so these players, given their roles, have had plenty of opportunity to infest, is the word I like to use, the U.S. rail industry with their operational excellence. And if you look at a video on YouTube called Railroad Workers Anthem by Brandon Petty, you will see in the first few minutes of that video, there's a woman that narrates. And what she says is that the rail industry in the U.S. has gotten significantly worse in the past 6 years. Well, gee, what has happened in the past 6 years as far as the U.S. rail industry? Folks, that is when Canada allowed a whole lot of rail executives that should have been not in boardrooms, but in courtrooms, in my humble opinion, to escape prosecution and to escape to the U.S. to infest 5 Class 1 rail carriers in the U.S. rail industry. And so the issues are massive. Whether or not you're a rail worker in Canada or in the U.S., you need to be looking at both both YouTube channels, the one on the UPNS Merger and the one on Rail Families United, because I will try and provide links for key series on both channels, but the Rail Families United may have stuff that won't appear on the UP channel, whatever. So double check both channels and make sure that you're aware of all the issues that have been going on for years behind the scenes. And I would say, folks, that these are criminal issues. And so the reason, by the way, that these people were allowed to escape to the U.S. is because it can clearly be shown via my dissection of a rail worker death investigation that not only the Transportation Safety Board, but also Transport Canada and the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada were all rail partners in crime. There to provide appropriate cover-ups in deaths, as in the case of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, and, there to turn a blind eye to so many issues. People need to understand CN and CP Rail both used to be crown corporations of the Government of Canada. They were part of the Canadian government until 1995, which is when they became publicly traded companies. But their ties to the Government of Canada run deep. And so, there's been a very nasty relationship there. Rather than being regulators, like I said, Transport Canada, the Transportation Safety Board, and the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada, rather than being regulators or organizations there to protect frontline rail workers and the public in general via the precedents that were set, they all decided to become what I call RAILPICs, rail partners in crime. There is no other way to put it, folks, when you look at these materials and understand the implications of all of it. And that includes, in my opinion, I'm an MA in finance, that includes a whole lot of financial fraud, in my humble opinion, also. And so that's what we're going to be going over. And even though this particular presentation on Jim Vena is not going to be that long compared to some of my others, all of those series, these other series that I'm doing, you can put the name Jim Vena on them, just like the name Claude Mongeau. If they have anything to do with the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, and they do, Jim Vena and Claude Mongeau are tied to that. In December of 2021, there was an activist investor by the name of TCI, specifically Chris Hone, who was British, I believe, was trying to take over the board of CN Rail and replace some of the people on the board with his list of candidates. I think there were 4 people he wanted to replace. And one of them was the current CEO of CN Rail, Jean-Jacques Ruet. The other was, he wanted to put a guy by the name of Paul Miller also on the board. And he wanted to replace Jean-Jacques Ruet, the CEO of CN Rail, with Jim Vena, who was Chief Operations Officer at the time that conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. Now, when you try to take over a board, do a hostile takeover of a board, you don't do that very easily. It probably costs them millions of dollars to try to do this, because you have to not only put your slate of candidates forward, but all the stockholders have to be sent proxy votes, and everybody needs to vote on this list of candidates as to whether or not they want to have these people replace those that are currently there. So, again, Chris Hone wanted to put Jim Vena as Chief Executive Officer at CN Rail. And when I saw that, well, and by the way, when they do these takeovers and it's quite a legal process involved. You don't just send out the proxy votes, but they have to tell people here's our legal team if you have questions. And they had hired 3 legal teams, 2 in Canada and 1 in New York, I believe, in order to do this hostile takeover. And so, when you do that, well, that's great because it gives me the opportunity to find the emails for those legal teams and to send them some very valuable information on the candidates. Specifically, at that time, I was worried about Jim Vena and a man who used to be in charge of safety at CN Rail, Paul Miller. But I had focused mainly on Jim Vena, not on Paul Miller. But his role, that alone, if you were a VP of safety, I had issues with that given what I had uncovered at CN Rail. But Jim Vena, again, was up for CEO at CN Rail. And so I wrote to all of these legal teams. And you can see here it was called TCI/CN Rail new CEO/board was the subject of the email. And you can see I had sent this on December 20th, 2021. I blanked out the people on the distribution list here. Those were the parents of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, their personal emails, and a few others. But anyway, but I had sent these lawyers files that let them know you've got a serious problem on your hands. The file so much so wrong, that one showed a whole lot of problems with the operational excellence of Jim Vena while he was at CN Rail. That talks about deadly training, slide number 53, and other things. But that file is actually quite long. But anyways, and then there's the index of documents, which let these lawyers know not only are there these documents that I'm sending you, but there's a whole lot of other documents pertaining to this death. And they could see that there was like 2,500 pages worth of documents that were already out there pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney under Jim Vena as Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail. And so, and I told them, as lawyers, you better be careful as to who you are putting forward for your slate of candidates, especially now that this information is out there. Because, if you are a party to pushing for such candidates to be the CEO at CN Rail, well, I think there's a lot of investors that would have an issue with that if you know what you now know, that there's serious concerns here. Because if you're a big law firm, in New York, I think this law firm had like 1,200 lawyers or something. It was a pretty big law firm, if I recall. But anyways, and I had CC'd the senior partners and whatever. But if you're a big law firm, I'm an MA in finance, folks, and boy, if you're not going to be disclosing material facts that you've learned to investors, and you keep being a party to this, it's not just the likes of CN Rail that could be sued, or the government of Canada. Maybe now it's also your big law firm that could be sued. And so, law firms that work with activist investors, in my opinion, had better tread lightly in working with activist investors, because there's a lot of nasty stuff behind the scenes, and it's been going on for a very, very long time. I personally am against the whole activist investor movement that we're now seeing taking over boards and whatever, because it shouldn't be one activist investor that gets to decide, because they're rich, and they have so many shares, who's going to be chairman or CEO or whatever. Sorry, but money doesn't buy everything. It might buy you a ticket to jail. If you keep pushing for some of these people, it might buy, hide a crime, you become a party to that crime, and financial fraud is financial fraud. And I don't think law firms want to be throwing themselves in that nasty hornet's nest. And so, anyways, I had advised them, be very careful as to who you are advising to have replace the current CEO, And folks, I had huge issues with Jean-Jacques Ruet also. He was former VP of marketing. And, I'm going to get into those issues when I do a video on Jean-Jacques Ruet also. Because I don't see how he could not have known about churning of the workforce and potential fake qualifications and whatever at CN Rail. But anyways, I'll be going into that in another video. But Jim Vena, I had huge issues with, and I was working behind the scenes. And not only telling these lawyers, do not put this guy as CEO of CN Rail. I had also called a very influential senator in the U.S. because CN had massive rail lines in the U.S. And I told that senator, I left a voicemail, do not allow this guy to become CEO at CN Rail. And so I don't know who it was that actually got Jim Vena to step down and out, and he withdrew his candidacy. I don't know if it's the government of Canada that got to him and said, you need to step away from this, or what. I don't know what happened specifically that made Jim Vena pull his candidacy at CN Rail for being CEO. I don't know if it was TCI that said step aside. I don't know. But something happened because Jim Vena, who was very much wanting this job about a month previously, now all of a sudden pulled his candidacy. And I suspect it was because of stuff that was going on behind the scenes. Not sure if it was one of his rail partners in crime at Transport Canada or the government of Canada, up to and including the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, who would have told him to pull out, because, folks, there would have been massive liabilities for the government of Canada if the government of Canada allowed this man to become CEO at CN Rail. And the government of Canada, by this time, absolutely knew about fake qualification issues and deaf cover-ups in the rail industry. And they knew Jim Vena had been Chief Operations Officer when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. So I don't think the government of Canada could have allowed that man to become CEO at CN Rail. Now the question becomes, if it was the government of Canada who blocked him and told him step aside, and go to the U.S., why did the government of Canada not bring Jim Vena to accountability and Claude Mongeau, and rather allowed them to escape to the U.S. along with others? Well, folks, again, rail partners in crime. And so, I was busy documenting not one massive scandal, but 3 massive scandals impacting U.S. national security. So I wasn't paying attention when Jim Vena was then up for CEO at Union Pacific in the U.S. I only found that out literally a couple of days before that decision was announced. But the government of Canada, in my opinion, has a lot to answer for, not only to Canadians, but to Americans. Why did you not bring these people who were violating the law to accountability? Well, folks, the simple answer to that one is because the regulators were not regulators. The Transportation Safety Board, which did reports, they weren't technically a regulator. They don't pick sides. They just write the reports in an unbiased way, right? I don't think so. When you look at that report and my analysis of it, it is anything but unbiased. So I lump them in there with rail partners in crime. The Transportation Safety Board, Transport Canada, and the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal of Canada, with what I would call their prearranged or predetermined hearing decisions in a tribunal before one word was even heard. And I'll be doing a separate video series on that whole issue also. But you can see, again, I was working in the background trying to prevent Jim Vena from becoming CEO or having any big role in any Canadian rail industry. But, I wasn't looking at all of the U.S. rail executives. And quite frankly, that should not have been my job. That should have been Transport Canada's job and Trudeau's job to work with the US to say, hey, we got concerns, don't put these people there. But they never did that, did they? Instead, they allowed a lot of rail executives to escape to the US to infest, in my opinion, no less than 5 Class 1 rail carriers that I know of. Huge issue. So this just provides a little more information that was in that email. I don't include all of it in here, but these are a couple more paragraphs that were in there where I'm basically telling them, again, be careful as to whom you want to put or keep as CEO of CN Rail, and even on CP boards, quite frankly. But because of the operational excellence of so many of the players, and to keep in mind the financial implications, which could also be huge for law firms, because, there is such a thing as legal malpractice. And if you're a stockholder and, a law firm does not disclose what it knows and it just allows all this to go forward, well, you may have client and attorney privilege, but I'm not their client. And if I disclose what I know, and, you've been caught not telling the truth to investors, that could bring a lot of legal malpractice type lawsuits, I think, on a big law firm. So they had a lot to lose. And I think any big law firm that engages in these activist investor takeovers, boy, you better think twice. Because punitive damages, especially in the US, can be absolutely massive. And the other thing, also I had told them about how Claude Mongeau had appeared before the Metropolitan Montreal Board of Trade and saying that he had the best IT team in the nation, basically. In Canada, and I would beg to disagree with that, and I'll be doing a separate video on that little talk. But rather than calling CN the backbone of the economy, I thought that a much better title would have been the very broken backbone of the economy, because things are, in my opinion, to this day, very broken at CN Rail. When you have a strike by CN and CP frontline rail workers and you're forced to arbitration, and I have a huge issue with the Canada Industrial Relations Board also, and members that are there, like one of the key players who would appear as a witness at the Occupational Health and Safety Tribunal for matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney. I think that because he played ball as the VP of the Teamsters Canada Rail Conference, the union representing rail workers, there's no way that the union would not have known they were violating laws when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. But this VP of the union was basically the only witness there representing frontline rail workers. Why were the 3 other witnesses not there? It was all a predetermined hearing and decision, and nasty precedents were set in that hearing, in my humble opinion, putting frontline rail workers at even greater risk, with the help of a VP of the union representing frontline rail workers, in my humble opinion. But that man would go on to become a vice chair at the Canada Industrial Relations Board, which is when there's a strike, they're the ones that provide the arbitrators and do binding arbitration. And this is how it's going to be. And you're forced back to work, and we're going to decide who's going to get what and what the new contract's going to be. Well, excuse me, but if people knew of the likes of Roland Hackle being at the Canada Industrial Relations Board, I think that was payback for having played ball in matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney. That's my humble opinion. You're free to form your own when you look at those videos, when I do that video series. There's so many videos I have to put out. It took years just to document these issues. And now I'm going to have to spend another huge portion of my life doing videos to inform frontline rail workers because regulators still failed to do their jobs and protect frontline rail workers. So go ahead, pick the wrong side. Eventually, this is going to come back at you. And I will have no pity for anybody that gets sued. And, breach of public trust is a criminal offense for which you can be found personally liable. In other words, you can lose everything you personally own. So, to those who played a role in any of this, any organization, any player, any union, you better pick the right side. That's all I can say, because there will be accountability. But anyway, my final words to the TCI advisors, the legal advisors, was to remember the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in the U.S. because failure to disclose material facts to investors, well, that's the whole Enron scandal thing that came out of, I believe, Enron. And you could find a whole lot of executives and other players liable in matters of financial fraud when you fail to disclose material facts. And that act, I think, made it so that executives in companies have to attest to the fact that they are in compliance with all laws under which they operate. Well, folks, compliance audits are not limited to financial audits. You have to be in compliance with all laws. That means the Railway Safety Act, the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, the labor codes. Where are the compliance audits on the part of the Government of Canada, or CN Rail, and I would say CP Rail, in matters pertaining to frontline rail worker training programs, to ensure that these employees are getting the training they're supposed to get, that they're properly trained, that when they move from one location to another, we ensure that they've received the proper training, and on and on and on. Where are the compliance audits? Because failure to have those, that's a very serious thing in the financial world. And that was just my little reminder to these law firms that remember the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and be careful as legal advisors before you move forward with candidates like Jim Vena on your slate of candidates. So again, not sure exactly who made Jim Vena step aside, if it was the Government of Canada, if it was the legal teams, if it was Chris Hone, I don't know. But he did step aside and pull his candidacy, even though he was really gung-ho for having this position about a month earlier. So why did he step aside? I think he was forced to step aside. And I think he was probably told, move to the U.S. And if that was the case, that's just my hunch. That's just my opinion. But if that's the case, then the Government of Canada has a lot to explain, not only to the people of Canada, but to the people of the U.S., and especially frontline rail workers, rail customers, rail investors. Okay, my emails, and I had sent more than the one I've shown here, to TCI's legal representatives. Those went out in towards the end of 2021, and then some others went out in 2022, and that was all during the Biden administration. I also sent out emails just a few days prior to Jim Vena becoming the UP CEO, again under the Biden administration. But I only learned of that decision a few days before it was actually announced. So clearly it was already too late. That decision had been made. But again, why had that not been blocked in either Canada or the U.S.? Why did nobody speak up to protect frontline rail workers when they knew at the Surface Transportation Board what they knew and had known for years about Jim Vena? And the same, and fine, change of the guard, whatever. That's no excuse. There needs to be somebody that keeps track of these rail executives and who should or should not be allowed in that industry. Um, I'm a mother of one rail worker. It certainly isn't my job. I've been doing this for free for years in order to protect my child and other frontline rail workers. But, I'm the one having to go up against these multi-million-dollar rail executives with their tens of millions that they make each year. And I have to go against these multi-billion-dollar companies and organizations like the American Railroaders Association, uh, or you know, the Railway Association of Canada. They've all had a role in some of this. I'm not going to say the U.S. American Association of Railroads, but now that Jim Vena is the chairman there, looks like they got a decision or two to make, in my humble opinion. But anyways, I'm just saying, folks, I've been doing all this work, thousands and thousands of hours. My own time, my complete life has been nothing but the documentation of Government of Canada scandals, 3 of them impacting U.S. national security. And as bad as the rail scandal is, that's not even the worst one that I ended up popping on the desk of J.D. Vance, Jim Jordan, and others in the U.S. administration. And yes, I would suspect they're all the way up to the Trump desk now. If they're not, given what's being exposed now that we're having this UPNS merger, I'm sure it's going to become a little more of a hot button for the administration, because rail unions are going to have to pick a side here. So everything I have posted, folks, pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, the Brainwashing series, and I think there's 14 videos on that, just looking at the Transportation Safety Board report lies in that death. And then the series, I think there's 9 videos on deadly training materials and field practices, again, under Jim Vena and CEO Claude Mongeau when he was CEO of CN Rail, who then became a player at Norfolk Southern. So there's no way that these men and others could not have known that they were violating several laws when conductor trainee Jason Cluney was killed. And it's my definite opinion that both thus had to be a party to this total death cover-up. And if that would be the case, and you're free to form your own opinion when you look at these materials, should we have the likes of Jim Vena or Claude Mongeau or some of these others? Because as I go on in my videos, you're going to see other players, key players in the rail industry. Should they be allowed to remain in the rail industry, or should they be brought to accountability? I don't think they should just be able to walk away, go off, live in the sunset with our tens of millions of dollars at the expense of frontline rail workers who were likely killed because of your criminal negligence. So, as the daughter of a coroner, I just have such huge issues with this. And that's why I told my child too, yeah, the easy thing would have been for me to tell my child, get out of this industry. It's too dangerous. But then what happens when the next person gets killed? And the next person gets killed? And the next one? And the next one? And these people just keep moving up in the ranks and having bigger and bigger positions. Could you live with yourself? I know I couldn't. So I'm sure there's many that could be bought off and that could live with that just fine. Nobody can buy me off, and I could not live with another railroad worker's death. And I'm going to tell you something. When one rail worker was killed, My child asked that person's fiance about 3 years later, "How are you doing?" And that person's response, who was planning to marry this conductor who had been killed at CN Rail, another one. This was not conductor trainee Jason Cluney. This was another one. And that person responded when asked, "How are you doing?" 3 years after that conductor's death at CN Rail. The response was, "Every day on earth hurts." So, all these rail executives, regulators, they just move on. The rail workers forgotten within a week, and it's the families and loved ones that are left with the devastation. And that's not something I can just sit by and keep allowing. So that's why I do what I do. Okay, so this is going to end the video on Jim Vena specifically, but again, the entire series on brainwashing, the series on deadly training materials, all of that stuff falls under the leadership of Jim Vena when he was Chief Operations Officer at CN Rail. And so this is just a brief overview of that man's role to get the nuts and bolts, the very specific operational excellence, specific examples of what was going on at CN Rail under Jim Vena. And I think a lot of it probably still goes on. That's my humble opinion. But, when you send things to arbitration, the Canada Industrial Relations Board, which I have a lot of issues with, but when they did that with the last rail strike in Canada, when CP and CN, frontline rail workers, decided to strike, I think they got like a 3% raise or whatever. But the problem is the safety issues don't get addressed. Binding arbitration, everybody go back to work, you're stuck with another 3-year contract, whatever. And the issues are all swept under the carpets by organizations like the Canada Industrial Relations Board, which again, given the fact that Roland Hackle became a vice chair there after the death of conductor trainee Jason Cluney, I have a huge issue with the Canada Industrial Relations Board having the right to force workers back to work and then give them this binding arbitration BS without addressing the issues that frontline rail workers are trying to put forward. They're always muzzled. Can't talk to the press, can't say anything, whatever. Well, I'm not muzzled. Nobody is going to muzzle me. And so I would encourage you to look forward to everything else that's going to be disclosed in these matters. And it's going to be one heck of a roller coaster ride, so fasten your seatbelt, because there's a lot of, when I say on my logo here, Rail Families United, strong ties through hard truths. There's a lot more hard truths that are going to be coming at you. So, folks, again, this concludes this video. Have a great day, and I will see you on the next one.